Margaret Sullivan sat in the back row of folding chairs set up on the Marine Corps Base parade ground, her weathered hands clutching a small American flag. The May sun beat down on the rows of proud parents and family members who had come to watch their sons and daughters graduate from basic training. At 62 years old, Margaret had driven 7 hours from her small house in Cedar Springs to this moment. She wore a simple navy blue dress that covered most of her arms, though the edge of an old tattoo peeked out near her right shoulder. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and despite the lines on her face, her eyes held a sharp, clear intelligence that missed nothing. "Excuse me, ma'am," a younger woman in a bright pink sundress tapped Margaret's shoulder. "Are these seats taken?" Margaret shook her head with a small smile. "Just me here, please sit down." The woman, who introduced herself as Denise, settled in with her husband Robert. They were there for their son, Tyler. Within minutes, Denise was chatting away, barely pausing for breath. "This heat is just unbearable. I don't know how these young people manage it." Denise fanned herself dramatically. "Is this your first time at a military graduation?" "No," Margaret said simply, her eyes scanning the field where the recruits would soon march. "Oh, did you have another son go through already?" Denise asked, leaning in with curiosity. "Something like that," Margaret replied, not elaborating. Robert leaned forward, trying to be friendly. "It's quite something, isn't it? All this military tradition. Of course, I would have served myself, but I had flat feet, medical exemption." Margaret nodded politely, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that some conversations were not worth having. The ceremony began with the thunderous sound of boots on pavement as the new Marines marched onto the field in perfect formation. Margaret's eyes immediately found her son, Jacob Sullivan, in the third row. Her heart swelled with pride. He stood tall and sharp in his dress blues, every inch a Marine. As the commanding officer began his speech, Denise whispered loudly to her husband, "I just hope Tyler remembers everything we taught him about being respectful and not getting too caught up in all this military nonsense. I told him this was just a stepping stone to college benefits." Margaret's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes forward. The ceremony continued with various officers giving speeches about honor, courage, and commitment. Then came the moment when the families would be called to pin the eagle, globe, and anchor on their Marines. Margaret stood when Jacob's name was called, smoothing down her dress. As she walked toward the field, Denise whispered to Robert, though not quietly enough, "Look at her. Probably one of those mothers who pushed her son into this because she couldn't make anything of herself." Margaret heard it as she was meant to. She had heard such things before, countless times in countless variations. She kept walking with her head high. Jacob's face lit up when he saw his mother approaching. Despite the rigid military bearing he was supposed to maintain, his eyes glistened with emotion. Margaret reached up. He had grown so tall, and carefully pinned the eagle, globe, and anchor to his uniform. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "I did it for you, Mom," Jacob said quietly. "Everything I am is because of you." Margaret hugged her son briefly, allowed by the ceremony's protocol, then returned to her seat. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness, but from the flood of memories this moment brought back. After the ceremony ended, families gathered on the lawn for refreshments and photographs. Margaret stood slightly apart, watching Jacob talk with his fellow Marines. He kept glancing over at her, making sure she was okay, but she waved him on. This was his day, his moment with his new brothers and sisters in arms. "Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret turned to find a tall man in a Marine officer's uniform approaching. He was young, perhaps 30, with captain's bars on his collar. "Yes. I'm Captain Bradley Chen. I was one of Jacob's instructors." He shook her hand firmly. "I wanted to tell you that your son is an exceptional Marine. His dedication, his discipline, his leadership, all outstanding." "Thank you, Captain. That means a great deal." Captain Chen smiled warmly. "He talks about you often, says you're the toughest person he's ever known." He paused. "He mentioned you raised him alone after his father passed." "Yes, Jacob was 3 when my husband died." "Well, you did a remarkable job. The Marine Corps is lucky to have him." Captain Chen nodded respectfully and started to turn away, then paused. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me saying, but Jacob mentioned you understood better than most parents what he was going through in training. Were you military yourself?" Margaret hesitated for just a moment. "I was, a long time ago." Which branch, if you don't mind me asking? Marine Corps, Margaret said quietly. A lifetime ago. Captain Chen's eyebrows rose with respect. Once a Marine, always a Marine, ma'am. Thank you for your service. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant across the base as families continued to celebrate. Margaret stood by a tree, sipping water from a plastic cup and watching Jacob pose for pictures with his platoon. The joy on his face made every sacrifice worthwhile. "Oh, there you are," Denise's voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere. She had clearly been making use of the punch bowl, which Margaret suspected had been fortified by someone's flask. "I wanted to get a picture of all the mothers together. Come on." "That's kind of you, but I'm fine here," Margaret said politely. "Nonsense, we're all so proud, aren't we? Even though—" Denise lowered her voice conspiratorially, swaying slightly. "Between you and me, I think this whole military thing is a bit outdated. I mean, what kind of mother really wants her child running around with guns?" Margaret's expression remained neutral, the kind who believes in service and sacrifice. "Well, yes, but there are other ways to serve. Tyler's just doing this for a year or two, then he's going to business school. Robert has connections." Denise looked Margaret up and down. "I suppose for some people the military is the only option. Not everyone can afford college otherwise." Before Margaret could respond, Robert joined them, trying to steer his wife away. "Denise, honey, let's go find Tyler." But Denise was not finished. "I was just saying, too, I'm sorry, I don't think you ever told me your first name." "Margaret." "Right, Margaret. I was just saying that it must have been hard raising a boy alone, no father figure. That's probably why Jacob needed this structure, this discipline. Compensating, you know." Margaret's hands tightened around her cup, but her voice remained steady. "My son has discipline because I taught him discipline. He has honor because I taught him honor. And he has courage because he saw it demonstrated every day of his life." Denise blinked, taken aback by the quiet steel in Margaret's voice. "Well, I didn't mean any offense. I just think some people romanticize the military when really—" "When really what?" Captain Chen's voice came from behind them. He had approached silently, his expression polite but his eyes sharp. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I couldn't help but overhear. You were saying something about the military." Denise flustered, suddenly aware she was speaking to an actual Marine officer. "Oh, no, I just meant—" "It's wonderful, of course. We're so proud of Tyler. I just meant that it's not for everyone forever, you know." "I understand completely," Captain Chen said smoothly. "The Marine Corps isn't for everyone. It requires a special kind of person, someone willing to put service above self, someone with genuine courage." His eyes flicked to Margaret with respect. "But those who have served, especially in combat, they carry something different, a strength that can't be taught in any classroom." "Combat?" Denise laughed nervously. "Well, that's all very noble, but thankfully those days are behind us for most people." Margaret remained silent, but something flickered across her face. A shadow of memory, of things seen and done that she would never speak of at a garden party. Captain Chen noticed. He had been trained to observe, to read people. His eyes caught the edge of the tattoo on Margaret's shoulder, just visible where her sleeve had shifted slightly. It was faded with age, but he could make out what looked like military insignia. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said carefully, "I noticed you served as well. When were you in?" "I enlisted in 1982, Margaret said. "Served until 1994. 12 years, Captain Chen said with genuine respect. "That's impressive. The Corps was different for women back then." "Different is one word for it," Margaret said with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes. Denise, feeling left out and irritated, jumped back in. "Well, I'm sure you had a nice office job somewhere. Filed papers or answered phones. That's what most women did in the military back then, right?" The silence that followed was deafening. Captain Chen's expression hardened. Before he could speak, Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "It's all right, Captain. Not everyone understands." "Understands what?" Denise pushed, emboldened by punch and ignorance. "I'm just saying that being in the military as a woman 30 years ago probably meant typing reports while the men did the real." "Denise," Robert finally found his spine and pulled his wife back. "That's enough. I apologize, ma'am. We should go find Tyler." As they walked away, Denise could be heard muttering about sensitive people who could not take a simple conversation. Captain Chen turned to Margaret, his jaw tight with anger on her behalf. "Ma'am, I apologize for that civilian's ignorance." Don't apologize, Captain. I've faced worse than careless words. Margaret's eyes had gone distant. Much worse. Would you mind if I asked? Captain Chen gestured to her shoulder. Your tattoo, is that what I think it is? Margaret glanced down at her shoulder, then back at the young captain. For a moment, she seemed to be deciding something. Then she reached up and carefully pulled the sleeve of her dress down just enough to reveal the full tattoo. Captain Chen's eyes widened. His face went pale. He actually took a step back, and his hand unconsciously moved to salute before he caught himself. Ma'am, his voice had changed completely, filled with awe and something close to fear. Is that real? Yes, Margaret said simply. But that means you were. Captain Chen could barely get the words out. The dates, the unit designation, ma'am, you were there, you were actually there. Margaret pulled her sleeve back up, covering the tattoo that had caused such a reaction. Like I said, Captain, a lifetime ago. Captain Chen stood frozen, his mind racing through military history, through the stories that were told in hushed tones in officer training, through the legends that most people thought were exaggerated. But the tattoo he had just seen was not a legend. It was proof of something extraordinary, something that most people, including that ignorant woman who had just insulted her, could never comprehend. Mrs. Sullivan, he said quietly, his voice shaking slightly, with your permission, I need to make a phone call. There's someone on this base who needs to meet you. Margaret shook her head. Captain, I appreciate the thought, but that's not necessary. I came to see my son graduate, that's all. Ma'am, respectfully, I don't think you understand. Colonel Briggs is the base commander. He was a lieutenant in the Gulf War. Captain Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. He knows the stories. If he knew you were here and I didn't tell him, I'd never forgive myself. Stories are often exaggerated, Margaret said softly. Time and distance make legends out of ordinary people doing what needed to be done. There was nothing ordinary about what you did. Captain Chen's voice was firm. Please, just give me 10 minutes. If you want to leave after that, I'll make sure you and Jacob aren't disturbed. Margaret looked across the lawn to where Jacob was still celebrating with his fellow Marines. He caught her eye and waved, his face glowing with happiness. She thought about all the years of keeping quiet, of letting people assume, of enduring small insults and casual dismissals because it was easier than explaining, easier than remembering. All right, Captain, she said finally, 10 minutes. Captain Chen pulled out his phone and walked a short distance away. Margaret could see him speaking urgently, gesturing. He kept glancing back at her as if afraid she might disappear. Within 5 minutes, a staff car pulled up to the lawn area, and a tall man in his late 50s stepped out. He wore the uniform of a full colonel, his chest decorated with numerous ribbons and medals. Colonel Briggs walked directly to Captain Chen, who pointed toward Margaret. The colonel's eyes found her, and even from a distance, Margaret could see his expression change from curiosity to disbelief to something approaching reverence. He approached slowly, almost carefully, as if Margaret might startle and run. When he was a few feet away, he stopped and came to attention. Ma'am, he said, his voice rough with emotion, Colonel James Briggs, Captain Chen tells me. He says you were part of Operation Silent Echo. Margaret's face remained impassive, but her hands trembled slightly. That operation is still classified, Colonel. The details are classified, Colonel Briggs agreed. But the fact that it happened and that 5 Marines went into hell and only 3 came back, that's not classified, that's history, that's legend. A small crowd was beginning to gather, sensing that something important was happening. Jacob pushed through, worry on his face. Mom, is everything okay? I'm fine, sweetheart, Margaret assured him. Ma'am, Colonel Briggs continued, I was a young lieutenant when I heard about what happened in Beirut in 1983. What your unit did, extracting those hostages while under fire, holding off an entire militia unit with just 5 Marines. They taught us about it in command school. They didn't use names, but they told us about the courage, the sacrifice. Denise had drifted back toward the gathering, drawn by the commotion. What's going on? Why is the colonel here? Captain Chen turned to her, his voice cold. The colonel is here to pay his respects to a genuine war hero, something you might have understood if you'd shown an ounce of respect earlier. Hero, Denise scoffed. She said she filed papers. I never said that, Margaret interrupted quietly. You assumed that. Colonel Briggs turned to look at Denise, his expression hard. Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but I suggest you listen very carefully. The woman you've been speaking to, the woman you dismissed as just another mother, is Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Sullivan, retired. She was awarded the Navy Cross for valor in combat. She saved the lives of 12 American hostages and 3 of her fellow Marines. She was shot twice, and she still carried a wounded Marine 3 miles through hostile territory to an extraction point. The color drained from Denise's face. The gathering crowd had grown silent. Jacob was staring at his mother with tears running down his face. "Mom, you never told me. You said you were stationed in North Carolina. You said you worked in logistics." "I did work in logistics," Margaret said gently, "for most of my service, but there were a few times when I was asked to do other things." "A few times?" Colonel Briggs said, shaking his head in wonder. "Ma'am, your file, what I've been cleared to see of it, shows 4 combat deployments. 4. When women weren't even supposed to be in combat roles. You were attached to special operations units as a translator and intelligence specialist, but you fought like a devil alongside the men." Margaret's voice was steady but quiet. "I did my job, Colonel, same as the men beside me, same as anyone who wears the uniform and takes the oath." "Why didn't you tell me?" Jacob asked, his voice breaking. "All these years I thought you just understood because you'd been in the Marines, but I didn't know you'd actually." "Because it was my past, not my present," Margaret said, reaching out to touch her son's face. "Because I wanted you to choose the Marines for your own reasons, not to live up to something I did. Because the things I saw, the things I didn't want them to touch you until you were ready to understand them." Colonel Briggs cleared his throat. "Ma'am, would you permit me to do something? I think these young Marines, these new graduates, deserve to know that a genuine hero is in their midst." Margaret shook her head. "Colonel, I really don't think." "Please," he said simply. "These kids need to understand that heroism isn't just in movies. It's real. It's standing here in a blue dress, having driven 7 hours to watch her son graduate." Margaret looked around at the gathered faces, young Marines in their dress blues, parents holding cameras, officers standing at respectful attention. She saw curiosity in some eyes, disbelief in others, and in Denise's face, absolute mortification. "All right," she said finally, "but keep it brief, Colonel. This is my son's day, not mine." Colonel Briggs nodded and raised his voice to address the crowd. "May I have everyone's attention, please? I apologize for the interruption to the festivities, but I've just learned that we have a distinguished guest among us today." The crowd grew larger as more people drifted over. The other drill instructors and officers had gathered, sensing something significant. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Margaret Sullivan, United States Marine Corps, retired. Some of you older folks might remember the Beirut barracks bombing in 1983. 241 American servicemen killed in a terrorist attack. It was one of the darkest days in Marine Corps history." Several people nodded. It had been a national tragedy, seared into the memory of anyone old enough to remember. "What most people don't know," Colonel Briggs continued, "is that in the weeks following that attack, there were several operations to extract American personnel and gather intelligence about the attackers. One of those operations went bad, very bad. A team of Marines was sent to extract hostages from a building controlled by militia forces. The team was ambushed. They were pinned down. They were outnumbered 20-1. The crowd was completely silent now. Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan was the intelligence specialist attached to that team. When the shooting started, she could have stayed in the protected position. She could have waited for extraction. Instead, she picked up a rifle from a fallen Marine and held off the attackers while her team got the hostages to safety. She was shot in the shoulder but kept fighting. When her staff sergeant was hit and couldn't walk, she carried him. While still bleeding from her own wound, she carried a man who outweighed her by 50 pounds across 3 miles of hostile territory. Jacob was openly weeping now, looking at his mother with new eyes. For her actions that day, she was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in combat. She was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but because of the classified nature of the operation, and because combat roles for women were officially prohibited at the time, the award was downgraded. Colonel Briggs's voice carried a note of old anger at that injustice. She saved 12 lives that day. 12 people who came home to their families because one Marine refused to leave anyone behind. Margaret stood still, her face composed, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Not tears of pride, but tears of memory, of friends lost, of the weight of that wounded Marine on her shoulders, of the fear and the pain and the desperate determination to get everyone home. Captain Chen stepped forward. "Ma'am, would you show them the tattoo? I think they should see." Margaret hesitated, then slowly pulled down the sleeve of her dress to reveal the full tattoo on her shoulder. It was faded with age but still clearly visible. An eagle, globe, and anchor, the Marine Corps emblem, surrounded by dates and a unit designation that made several of the older officers in the crowd catch their breath. Below it were 5 names. "Those are my team members," Margaret said quietly. "2 of them didn't make it home. I got this tattoo so I would never forget them, so they would always be with me." One of the older drill instructors, a master sergeant with gray hair and 30 years of service, stepped forward. He came to attention and saluted. "Gunny Sullivan, it's an honor, ma'am." Margaret returned the salute, a gesture that came back to her as naturally as breathing despite the decades since she had worn the uniform. One by one, the Marines in the crowd came to attention and saluted. Young Marines who had graduated that day, older officers who understood the weight of what she had done, even some of the parents who had served. It was a moment of pure respect, of recognition, of one warrior acknowledging another. Denise stood at the edge of the crowd, her face burning with shame. She tried to slip away, but Robert held her arm. "No," he whispered firmly. "You need to see this. You need to understand what you said to her." When the salutes finally dropped, Colonel Briggs spoke again. "Gunny Sullivan represents the very best of the Marine Corps. She served with honor, fought with courage, and carried her brothers when they couldn't carry themselves. And then she came home, raised a son as a single mother, and never once asked for recognition or special treatment. She just lived her life with the same quiet dignity she showed in combat." He turned to Jacob. "Private Sullivan, you told me during training that your mother was the strongest person you knew. You had no idea how right you were. You come from a legacy of genuine heroism. I hope you're ready to live up to it." Jacob snapped to attention, tears still streaming down his face. "Yes, sir. I'll spend my whole career trying to be half the Marine she is." Margaret stepped forward and put her hand on her son's arm. "You already are, sweetheart. You became a Marine for the right reasons, to serve something bigger than yourself. That's all I ever did. That's all any of us can do." Colonel Briggs nodded. "Ma'am, I know you came here just to watch your son graduate, but would you do us one more honor? Would you join me and the other officers for the final ceremony? I think you've earned the right to stand on that platform." Margaret shook her head gently but firmly. "Thank you, Colonel, but no. My place is in the crowd watching my son. That's where I want to be. That's where I belong today." "I understand." Colonel Briggs extended his hand and Margaret shook it. "But before you leave this base, please come by my office. There are some people, some of the men you saved that day, who would very much like to thank you in person. They live near here now. They've asked about you over the years, but your file was sealed. With your permission, I'd like to arrange a meeting." Margaret's composure finally cracked slightly. Her voice was thick with emotion. They're all right, all 12 of them." "All 12, Colonel Briggs confirmed. "They came home because of you. They had families because of you. There are children and grandchildren who exist because you refused to give up." Margaret nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she composed herself. "I'd like that very much, Colonel, thank you." As the formal ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Denise approached Margaret hesitantly. Her earlier bravado was completely gone, replaced by genuine shame. "Mrs. Sullivan," she began, her voice small, "I owe you an apology, a big one. I said terrible things. I assumed. I was so wrong." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said simply, "You were wrong. But you weren't wrong because of who I am. You were wrong because you assumed that a quiet woman, a mother, someone who doesn't brag or demand attention, couldn't possibly have done anything significant. You were wrong because you judged worth by noise rather than substance." "I'm so sorry," Denise whispered. "I accept your apology," Margaret said. "But do me a favor. The next time you meet someone, especially a woman, especially someone older, especially someone who doesn't demand the spotlight, remember that you have no idea what they've survived, what they've sacrificed, or what they've accomplished. Quiet strength is still strength. Often it's the strongest kind." Denise nodded, wiping tears from her eyes. "I will, I promise I will." As the sun began to set over the base, Margaret stood with Jacob, his arm around her shoulders. Around them, young Marines celebrated with their families, beginning their journey in the Corps. Some would serve for a few years, some for a career, and some, like Margaret, would carry the weight of extraordinary moments for the rest of their lives. "Mom," Jacob said quietly, "why did you really never tell me?" Margaret was silent for a moment, watching the flags snap in the evening breeze. Because the people who talk the most about being heroes usually aren't. Real heroism isn't about glory or recognition. It's about doing what needs to be done when the moment demands it, and then going home and living your life. I didn't want you to think being a Marine was about being a hero. I wanted you to understand it's about service. It's about showing up every day and doing your duty, whether anyone's watching or not. "You carried a man 3 miles while you were shot," Jacob said, shaking his head in wonder. "That's not just duty, Mom, I don't even have words for what that is." "That was love," Margaret said simply. "Love for my brothers in arms, love for the people I was trying to save, love for my country. When you love something enough, you find strength you didn't know you had. You'll understand that yourself one day, sweetheart. When your brothers need you, you'll be there, not because you're trying to be a hero, but because that's what Marines do. We don't leave anyone behind." As darkness fell, the base lights came on, illuminating the parade ground where hundreds of young Marines had taken their oaths that day. Margaret thought about the 18-year-old girl she had been when she first enlisted, young and scared and determined to prove herself. She thought about the woman she had become through fire and blood and sacrifice. And she looked at her son, strong and proud in his uniform, beginning his own journey. "I'm proud of you," she told him again. "I'm proud of you too, Mom," Jacob replied. "And I'm going to make sure people know. I'm going to make sure your story isn't forgotten." Margaret smiled but shook her head. "The story that matters is the one you're going to write yourself. Be a good Marine, be a good man, serve with honor. That's all I ever did, and it's all I'll ever ask of you." They stood together as the stars came out above the base. A mother and son, two Marines separated by generations but united by the same oath, the same commitment, the same unshakable belief that some things are worth fighting for. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, the names tattooed on Margaret's shoulder, the friends who didn't come home, looked down and smiled, knowing their sacrifice had not been in vain, knowing they lived on in the quiet strength of the woman who had never forgotten them.